quilt is made out of the things other people throw away. Worn-out shirts, a dress somebody outgrew, the one good corner of a tablecloth, the rest of which was ruined, feed sacks, scraps too small to be worth anything to anybody. You cut away the used-up parts and you keep the good, and you piece all those thrown-away things together, a little at a time, by hand, until you have made something that will keep a person warm for 50 years. That is the whole art of it. You take what the world discarded and you make it into something worth having. I have been making quilts for 60 years. In a mill town in Alabama, where the kudzu grows over everything and the summers sit on you like a wet quilt themselves. And in all that time, I learned one thing about my craft that turned out to be the truest thing about my life, too. You can always see the hand of the maker in the stitches. A quilt remembers who made it. Turn it over, look at the back where nobody's supposed to look, and there, in the knots and the little imperfect lines, is the whole truth of the person who sat up nights putting it together out of love and leftovers. My name is Odessa. I'm 72 years old, and I raised my grandson from the time he was a baby, pieced his whole life together out of scraps the way I piece everything. And I'm going to tell you about the day I gave him the finest quilt I ever made, at his wedding, in front of everyone, and learned that he had spent years being ashamed of the seams. Before I go on, let me ask you something to hold. Have you ever poured everything you had into somebody, raised them or carried them or built them up, and then watched them climb up into a world that looked down on where they came from and start to be ashamed of it and of you? If you know that particular ache, the ache of being somebody's beginning that they'd rather forget, then sit with me a while, because this one is for you. I have to tell you how Preston came to be mine, because you can't understand the wound without understanding the love that made the room for it. My daughter Ruby was my only child, and she had Preston young, and his daddy was gone before he was born. And when Preston was still in diapers, Ruby got sick, the fast kind, and within a year I buried my girl and became a mother again at an age when most women are becoming grandmothers. I was in my 40s, working, and suddenly I had a baby. There was never any question about it. He was mine. He was all I had left of Ruby, and I loved him with a fierceness that scared me sometimes. And I want you to understand what raising him meant, because that's the part he grew ashamed of. It meant I quilted. I'd always quilted, but now I quilted like it was a second job, because it was. I took in piecework. I made quilts for the church to sell. I made them for the fancy shop 2 towns over that marked them up 4 times what they paid me and sold them to tourists as authentic Alabama folk art. My hands are the way they are now, knotted up like old rope, because of the years I spent putting a roof over that boy's head, 1 stitch at a time. I cleaned houses when the quilting wasn't enough. I did whatever there was to do, and I never once let him feel poor, because a child who is loved right doesn't know he's poor. He just knows he's warm, and I made sure that boy was warm. Every bed in our little house had a quilt on it that I'd made, and he'd trace the patterns with his finger and ask me where each scrap came from. And I'd tell him, "This was your mama's Sunday dress. This was your granddad's work shirt. This piece here is from the little gown they brought you home from the hospital in." I was stitching him a family out of the people he'd lost. I was giving him a history he could wrap around himself at night. There was a day I hold on to, from when he was maybe 8. The school had a thing where the grandparents came in, and I almost didn't go, because I'd been cleaning the Hadley place all morning and I was tired, and I didn't have a nice dress. But I went, in my work clothes, straight from mopping other people's floors, and I brought a little quilt to show the class, one of my story quilts, and I told those children where every scrap came from. And when I was done, my grandson stood up in front of everybody, this little boy, and he said, loud, "That's my grandma. She can make anything out of anything." And the whole class looked at me like I was somebody. He was proud of me then. He was proud of my hands and my scraps and the fact that I could make something out of nothing. I have gone back to that day 1,000 times since, because I need to know it was real, that the shame came later and was put into him by the world, that once, before he learned to be embarrassed, my grandson stood up in a classroom and claimed me out loud. Whatever he became, that boy existed. I made him a quilt of his whole life, and for a while, he knew the worth of it. He was a bright boy, brighter than anybody in our line ever had been, and I knew it early, and I poured everything into it. I sat with him over his homework at the kitchen table under a bare bulb while my eyes gave out on the fine stitching, and I told him he could be anything, go anywhere, and I meant it. And God help me, I was proud to say it. When he got the scholarship to the university, I cried for a week. When he got into law school, I sold a quilt I'd been saving, one that had taken me 2 years, my very best work, to help with what the scholarships didn't cover. And I never told him I'd sold it because I didn't want him to feel the weight of it. I wanted him light. I wanted him to fly. And he flew. That's the thing. It worked. Everything I poured into that boy worked. And he became a lawyer in a city 3 hours away. A good one. And he did well. Better than well. And I was so proud I thought I'd burst with it. I told everybody at church, "That's my grandson. I raised him. Look what he did." I didn't notice, at first, that he had stopped saying the second part back. It came on slow, the way the worst things do. So slow, you keep explaining it away. First it was that he came home less. Well, he was busy. An important man. Of course he was busy. Then it was that when he did come, he seemed to see our little house differently. Seemed to notice the worn spots, the mismatched furniture, the quilts I was so proud of. And something would cross his face, quick, before he covered it. Then he got engaged to a girl from an old family, real money, the kind of people who've had it so long they're quiet about it. And I was thrilled for him. And I started to notice that I was never invited to meet them. Months went by. He'd been engaged half a year and hadn't once brought his bride to meet the woman who raised him. And when I finally asked, gentle, when I might get to meet her people, he got a look and said it was complicated, that her family moved in certain circles, that he'd handle it. Her family moved in certain circles. I turned that phrase over in my hands for a long time, the way I'd turn over a piece of cloth, deciding if it was good enough to use. And I understood, slowly, that in the story my grandson was telling about himself in his new life, there was no room for a quilting grandmother from a mill town who cleaned houses. I had become a scrap, a used-up part he needed to cut away to make the rest of the thing look right. I started hearing, secondhand, the story he told about himself now, that he'd been raised by his late mother, mostly, and had made his own way after. that he was self-made, pulled himself up by his bootstraps, no help from anybody, and every version of that story did the same thing, quietly, surgically. It cut me out. 40 years of my hands, my nights, my sold quilts, my ruined eyes, and in the story of his life, I had been reduced to nothing, or worse than nothing, to a thing best not mentioned. He didn't tell people his grandmother raised him. When he couldn't avoid mentioning me at all, I heard. He called me the woman who looked after me growing up, the woman who looked after me, like I was hired, like I was help he'd had, instead of the person who'd given up her whole second life so he could have a first one. The cruelest part, and I'll be honest that it took me a while to feel the full size of it, is that he wasn't ashamed of something I'd done wrong. There was no scandal, no failing, nothing I needed to be forgiven for. He was ashamed of my life itself, of honest work and a plain house and a craft done with the hands. He was ashamed that I was homemade in a world that had taught him to want everything store-bought. And a person can survive being blamed for something they did. It is a different and deeper thing to be quietly erased for simply being what you are by the one person you gave everything to make. There was one visit, the last real one before the wedding, that told me everything. He'd come home for something, and a colleague of his stopped by, another lawyer, up from the city. And I came out of the kitchen in my apron with a plate of the tea cakes I'd made because company was coming. And I put out my hand and started to say I was Preston's grandmother. And my grandson stepped in, smooth as anything, and said, "This is Odessa. She's helped look after the place for years." She's helped look after the place. And he took the plate from my hands and set it down and steered his colleague out to the porch. And I stood in my own kitchen, in the house where I'd raised him, holding my own tea cakes, just introduced as hired help in my own home by the baby I'd nursed through croup. I didn't say anything. I told myself I'd misunderstood, that he was flustered, that it didn't mean what it felt like it meant. That is the thing shame does to the people around it. It makes you do its work for it, explaining it away. So the person doing the erasing never even has to feel the weight of what they've done. I spent months explaining that man's shame to myself so he wouldn't have to carry it. That is its own kind of quilting, I suppose. Taking the ugly scraps somebody hands you and stitching them into something you can almost live under. I'm going to tell you about the wedding, because that's where it all came to a head. But first, I have to tell you about the quilt, because the quilt is the heart of this. When Preston got engaged, I did what my mother did, and her mother before her. I started making him a wedding quilt. It is the most important thing a woman like me can give, and I put everything into it. I worked on it for 2 years, in secret, in the evenings. And I didn't just make him any quilt, I made him his life. I had kept, all those years, a trunk of scraps, and into that wedding quilt I pieced the whole story I'd been telling him since he was small. A square from Ruby's Sunday dress, so his mother would be at his wedding after all. A square from the gown they brought him home in. A piece of his granddad's shirt. The corner of his first baby blanket. A bit of the dress I wore the day I took custody of him. I stitched his entire history into that quilt, every person who had loved him, every scrap of where he came from, made beautiful, made whole, made warm. It was the finest thing I have ever made in 60 years of making things. I meant for him to wrap his own children in it someday and tell them where each piece came from, the way I'd told him. I meant to hand him his history so he'd never lose it. I want to tell you about the night I almost decided not to go to the wedding at all, because I nearly did. And the people who tell these stories always leave out how close you come to just disappearing to make it easier on everyone. The invitation, when it finally came, was addressed formally, and I was not listed anywhere in the program as family. I found out from a cousin that I'd been seated not with the family, but at a table near the back, the table where they'd put distant acquaintances and, I understood, the woman who used to look after him. I heard that when the wedding planner had asked Preston about the grandmother, about whether I'd be part of the family photographs, he'd said it wasn't necessary, that it would just complicate the seating. It wasn't necessary. That I'd be in the pictures of the family I had single-handedly kept alive. And I sat in my little house, with that finished quilt folded across my lap, 2 years of my failing eyes and my knotted hands. And I thought, I should just stay home, send my regrets, mail him a nice card. Because I understood that my going was an embarrassment to him, that my plain face and my homemade dress and my very existence would be, to him, a stain on the beautiful day he'd built. And I loved him enough, even then, even after everything, that some part of me wanted to spare him that. I thought, I'll love him from here. I'll let him have his shiny world without me dragging my Milltown into it. I got as far as writing the regrets. I had the pen in my hand, and then I looked down at the quilt, at Ruby's Sunday dress, at the little gown, at 60 years of my hands and 40 years of my love, all pieced together into something beautiful out of what the world threw away. And I thought, no, I am not ashamed of one single stitch of this. I am not ashamed of my life, or my hands, or my daughter's Sunday dress, or the honest work that raised that boy up high enough to look down on me. I did nothing wrong. I loved a child with everything I had, and there is no shame in that, no matter how fine the people are that he's marrying into. And I decided I would go, not to force myself on him, not to make a scene, but to give my grandson the quilt I made him, with love, and to hold my head up in that room full of old money, because a life pieced together by hand out of love and leftovers is worth more than anything you can buy. And I was done. I was finally done, pretending otherwise to make it easier for a boy I'd spoiled into being ashamed of me. So I went. The wedding was at an estate, the kind of place with white columns and a lawn like a golf course, and more forks than a person could ever need. And I wore my good dress, the one I'd made myself, and I carried that quilt in a plain box, and I sat at my table in the back where they'd put me, and I watched my grandson marry his bride under a canopy of flowers that cost more than I'd made in some whole years of my life. And he looked so handsome and so far away, and I was proud and I was breaking, both at once, the way you can only be about someone you raised. Here is what I did not know. For the ceremony, they had put a small microphone on Preston, clipped inside his lapel, the way they do now, so that the video will catch the vows clearly, and so that the guests too far back can hear. And that microphone fed to speakers, and it fed to the screens they had set up, so the overflow guests, and the relatives watching from far away on a live feed could see. And after the ceremony, in the bustle, nobody thought to switch it off. My grandson had a live microphone on him, and he had forgotten it was there. The way you forget a thing that's become part of you. And during the reception, before the dinner, Preston stepped away with his new mother-in-law, a woman named Camille, into a quiet side room off the main hall, not knowing that his voice was still going out, low and clear, to every speaker and every screen in that place, and to all the relatives watching at home. I was at my table when it happened. The room had that pleasant hum of a party, and then, over the speakers, cutting through it, came my grandson's voice, and the room went quiet to listen, because at first, people thought it was a toast. It was not a toast. Camille had asked him, kindly, I think, about the older woman who'd come, the one sitting alone at the back table with a box. She'd noticed me, and my grandson's voice, filling that whole beautiful room, said, "Oh, that's just the woman who raised me, my grandmother. She's harmless. She won't stay long." And Camille said something I couldn't hear, and Preston went on, and every word came out of every speaker in that estate, and into the phones of every cousin watching from home. He said, honestly, it's a whole situation. She's from a different world. She quilts. She cleaned houses. I couldn't exactly not invite her, but I've been managing it. He said, between you and me, once things settle down, I'm going to move her into a facility. There's a county home that's not too dear, and sell that little house. It's the practical thing. She can't really keep living in the past out there. He laughed, my grandson laughed, and he said, she made me some kind of homemade quilt for a wedding gift. Can you imagine? I'll have to find somewhere to put it where it won't be seen. It's not exactly the aesthetic. And then the microphone, having done its work, was finally noticed by someone and switched off. But it was too late. It had already spoken the truth in my grandson's own voice to the whole room and to the whole family, the way the back of a quilt tells you the truth about the maker, whether the maker meant it to or not. And not just the room. Every relative watching that live feed from back home heard it too. The whole church, the cousins, the neighbors who'd known Preston since he was a baby in my arms, all of them sitting in their front rooms 3 hours away, watching the fine wedding on their screens, proud of our boy who'd made good, and hearing him, in his own voice, call the woman who raised him a situation he was managing. My phone, later, was full of messages from home, and every one of them said some version of the same thing. Odessa, we heard. We always knew what you did for that boy. We are so sorry. The town that watched me raise him had just watched him try to erase me, and they had chosen, every one of them, the truth they'd seen with their own eyes over the story he'd been selling. There is a mercy in that I didn't expect, being known by the people who watched you do the work. You could have heard a pin drop in that whole grand place, and every single person in that room turned, slowly, to look at the old woman sitting alone at the back table, with a plain box in her lap. I want to tell you, I stood up and made a speech. I didn't. I have too much dignity for that. And besides, my grandson had just made the only speech that mattered, without knowing it, in his own voice. I simply sat there, with my hands folded on the box that held 2 years of my love, and I let the truth he'd told hang in that beautiful air. Because there was nothing I needed to add. He had cut me out of the story of his life so many times, in so many rooms, and now, at last, In front of every single person whose good opinion he had traded me for, he had told them all exactly who he was. A man ashamed of the woman who gave up her life for him. A man who called love a situation to be managed. I didn't have to expose him. He had a live microphone and a full heart of shame, and those two things did the whole job. And then something happened I did not expect. Camille, the mother-in-law, the fine woman from the old family, came back into the main hall, and she was white in the face, and she walked, in front of everyone, straight past her own daughter, straight past my grandson, all the way to the back of the room, to my table. And she stopped in front of me, and she said, in a voice that shook, "Ma'am, I would be honored if you would come sit with the family." And then she said something I will never forget as long as I live. She said, "I grew up in a house with dirt floors before I married into all this, and there's not a soul at the head table who knows it. And I have spent 40 years letting them think I came from money because I was ashamed, just like him." And she looked at that plain box in my lap, and her eyes filled up, and she said, "Is that the quilt? Would you let me see it?" And I opened the box, right there, and I unfolded my grandson's whole life across that back table. Ruby's Sunday dress, and the little homecoming gown, and his granddad's shirt. And Camille put her hand over her mouth, and this rich woman who had spent her life hiding her dirt floors looked at 40 years of a poor woman's love made visible. And she wept, because she knew exactly what it was worth, the way only somebody who came from where I came from could know. And the room gathered around, all those fine people, looking at the most valuable thing in that whole expensive place, which was a homemade quilt pieced out of a dead girl's Sunday dress by a woman her grandson was ashamed of. I found myself telling them, quietly, what each piece was, the way I'd told those school children 40 years before, the way I'd told Preston himself when he was small. This square is my daughter Ruby's Sunday dress. She died when the boy was a baby, so I put her right here so she could be at his wedding. This is the gown they brought him home from the hospital in. This is his granddad's work shirt. And these fine people, who had come to see white columns and expensive flowers, stood in a hush and listened to an old woman name the dead over a blanket. And I watched something move through them, a kind of hunger, because there was not one soul in that beautiful room who wouldn't have traded every fork on their table to be loved the way that quilt had been made. Money can buy you a great many things. It cannot buy you somebody who sat up for 2 years stitching your whole history into something warm. They knew it. You could see them know it. And the plain box that my grandson had wanted hidden somewhere it wouldn't be seen became, for one evening, the thing every rich person in that room stood quietly around, wishing it had been made for them. Here is what it cost my grandson, and it is the coldest price I know of, and he did every bit of it to himself. He did not go to jail. There is no law against being ashamed of your grandmother, only a judgment, and it is a heavy one. What Preston lost at his own wedding, in front of the exact people he had spent years and traded his own history to impress, was their respect, permanently and beyond any repair. Because those people, the old money people he thought he was joining, they may have had a great many faults, but they understood loyalty and blood and character, and they had all just heard a man reveal, in his own voice, that he was ashamed of the woman who raised him from a baby and planned to warehouse her in a county home to sell her house. There is no coming back from that, in a world that runs on who your people are and how you treat them. He had spent his whole life climbing toward their good opinion, and he reached the top and opened his mouth and threw it off a cliff. His new wife could not look at him. His mother-in-law had just walked across the room to honor the woman he'd discarded. He stood in the middle of his own perfect wedding and understood. I watched it land on him, that he had become a man that fine people were ashamed of, which was the one thing in the whole world he had traded everything to avoid becoming. He had cut away his own foundation to make himself look finished, and the whole structure came down at once, in front of everybody, on the happiest day of his life. And he realized it. That's the part I carry, more than the vindication, because when the room turned and Camille walked past him, I saw my grandson's face, and under the horror there was a little boy, the one who used to trace the patterns on his quilt and ask me where each piece came from. And I saw that little boy understand, all at once, what he had done and who he had become and what he had thrown away. And it was not triumph I felt, looking at him. It was grief. I had lost my Ruby, and now, in a different way, I had lost the boy I'd stitched her memory into. And no vindication in the world fills a hole like that. We are not close now, my grandson and I. He tried, afterward, in the way of a person trying to repair a thing they've broken past repair. And I have not slammed the door, because I am his grandmother, and I will be until I die, and that is not a thing his shame can cut away. But I have not pretended it didn't happen, either. When he called, some weeks later, and started to explain, to manage it, I told him plainly, "Preston, I heard you. The whole family heard you. You are not ashamed of something I did. You are ashamed of who I am and who you are. And that is a thing you will have to fix inside yourself. And I cannot fix it for you. And I will not pretend it away to make you comfortable. I love you. I have loved you since before you could speak. And I am not going to a county home. And I am not selling my house. And I am not ever again going to make myself smaller so that you can feel bigger in front of people who, it turns out, think more of me than they do of you." I said it without heat. I said it the way you'd tell somebody a plain, true thing. And then I told him the quilt was still his, whenever he was ready to not be ashamed of it. And I hung up, and I went back to my frame. Camille and I write to each other now. She comes to see me, that fine woman with the dirt floor secret. And she sits in my little house under my quilts, and she is more at home there than she has been anywhere in 40 years. And I am teaching her to piece, and her stitches are terrible and getting better. The county home is a joke between us now. The fancy shop 2 towns over put my wedding quilt in their front window when the story got around, and offered me more for it than I've ever been paid for anything. And I told them it wasn't for sale, that it belonged to my grandson whenever he grew up enough to want it, and that until then it would stay folded in my trunk with the rest of who we are. Something else changed, and it's the change that matters most, though it happened quiet inside me. For a long time, without ever quite saying it, I had let my grandson's climbing be the measure of my worth. His success was going to be the proof that my life had counted for something, that the sold quilts and the ruined eyes and the cleaned houses had all been worth it. I had pinned my own value to his opinion of me, and so when he grew ashamed, some part of me had started to wonder if maybe he was right, if maybe a homemade life really was a lesser thing. That wedding cured me of it. Not because a room full of rich people admired my quilt, though I won't pretend that didn't feel good, but because standing there, naming Ruby's dress over that blanket, I finally understood that my worth was never his to grant or take away. It was in the work. It was in the love. It was in the 60 years of making something warm out of what got thrown away. I had been a fine and useful and loving woman every single day of my life, whether that boy in his fancy suit knew it or not. And I did not need his shame or his pride, either one, to tell me what my own 2 hands were worth. I stopped waiting to be claimed. I claimed myself. So if you are out there tonight, and you have loved somebody up into a world that taught them to be ashamed of you, let me tell you what 60 years of quilting taught me about the worth of a homemade thing. There is no shame in being pieced together out of what the world discarded. The scraps are not the weakness of the quilt. They are the whole beauty of it. They are the proof that somebody took what was thrown away and loved it into something warm. Do not ever let anyone make you ashamed of your seams. The people worth having will turn your life over. Look at the back, where the knots are, where the real work holds, and understand exactly what they're looking at. And the ones who are ashamed of your stitches were never worthy of the warmth. You keep your head up, you keep your hands working, and you remember that a life sewn together by love out of leftovers will keep a person warm long after all the store-bought things have worn to nothing.